Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bipin Kumar. I work a volunteer with CSPC. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge and that while we are meeting virtually, we are all joining from various traditional territories across Turtle Island. I'm joining you today from Regina, which is a traditional territory of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dakota, Nakota, Lakota, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We recognize the enduring presence and resilience of Indigenous people across Canada and are grateful for the opportunity to gather and share knowledge on these lands. I invite our attendees to share their own land acknowledgements in the chat as we get started. Before we dive into the panel, have an exciting update regarding accessibility. Today, we are testing simultaneous interpretation through the Wordly app right here on Zoom. For captions, you would see an option on the screen to enable Wordly app with which you can select your preferred language to see live transcript of your conversation. Uh, we are also dropping a link on the chat right now through which you are able to connect a special link on the tab on your browser on your mobile device, and you can choose to listen to live audio in either English or French. When using the web link for audio, please mute the main Zoom room window to avoid hearing two voices. Since we are piloting this technology to make our panels more inclusive, we thank you for your patience and would love your feedback as we work to increase bilingual accessibility for our audience. Now, I would like to pass it on to Dr. Stephanie E. Michard, President and CEO of Biocan RX, to take it from here. Welcome, Dr. Stephanie, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Bipin. It's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to join all of you here today for this webinar on adoption of cell and gene therapies in Canada. As mentioned, my name is Stephanie Michaud, and I'm President and CEO of BioCanRx. Before we begin, I would like to start off by informing the audience that CSPC is going to launch a quick demographics poll. It's anonymous, it's voluntary, and it's intended to help us understand the diverse perspectives present in the room at this webinar here today. So we'll keep that open for about a minute, and you should see it on screen now, and I would invite you to share information about your sector and which region of Canada or the world that you're attending this session from. And we'll just give that a minute. And I am keeping an eye on the chat, and there are a few messages with respect to the sound quality of the webinar, that there is a bit of an echo, and also that the Worldly ID session does not appear to open. So just flagging that to our colleagues at CSPC. And please, those that are in attendance at this webinar right now, if you can keep us appraised of any type of sound issue or any other issue that you're having with the apps, that would be terrific. I'd like to begin first by situating this webinar that we're hosting today, and we're really pleased to have a number of outstanding speakers to participate and to provide additional information. And thanks everybody for letting me know that the sound quality has been improved. That's great. Really appreciate that. So the slide that you have before you is a representation of the translational research continuum, and this is an area of research that, especially in Canada, is not often described. And what I wish to draw your attention to is that there are really two valleys. The first valley is affectionately known as the Valley of Death, and it is the trajectory and the path that must be traversed when taking an invention all the way to a clinical trial. And of course, here, this whole session is speaking about drug development and seeing as the products that are being developed are ultimately going to be used in humans. There are lots of necessary checks and balances with regulatory authorities around the whole world. And this is a very well-trodden path. That first valley of translational research is quite a deep valley here in Canada, and something that we don't do as frequently as we should, perhaps. And it's one of the reasons why an organization like BioCanRx has been created. And so we'll be speaking about this a little bit, about what it takes to be able to bring a discovery all the way towards a clinical trial, and really what the necessary steps are to make that happen. The second valley that is on the right really focuses on adoption. And so, what does it take once you have successful results and good results that the regulator is satisfied with? What does it take to get these types of products to people that is incorporated into our healthcare systems? And progressing through all of these phases is really what it takes to bring a new therapy to patients. And it's really what underlies this entire continuum. Is the need for high quality evidence collected through clinical trials, through economic data, and that's attainable through translational research. The kind of evidence that's collected, it reduces the uncertainty and it moves therapies, as I've mentioned, from discovery all the way into clinical development and ultimately being adopted into healthcare systems and bring the patient benefits that what we're seeing can be achieved, extraordinary results when we're speaking about advanced therapies like CGTs. And for those that are wondering, a CGT is a cell and gene therapy, which are bringing incredible results to the healthcare landscape, and that can be that and hold the potential for curing or significantly improving the course of life-threatening and chronic disease. These therapies, they're a lot of them are biologics, and definitely a CGT is a biologic. And so they're complex therapies to develop, they're expensive therapies to develop. And so there are complexities associated to their development. And so across that development pathway, we're seeing a persistent gap in what we're going to be discussing today. And that gap is not in innovation, but it's in the generation of the right evidence at the right time to support regulatory decisions, reimbursement, and clinical adoption, and ultimately patient access. So today's discussion is grounded in a simple but critical idea. Translational research is the engine that builds confidence across the entire system. And so the question that we're going to explore today is what evidence actually unlocks translation of CGTs, and how do all the players in the system ensure that this evidence is generated in a way that positions Canada not just to adopt these therapies, but to assume a leadership position in the development of these therapies. So before we launch into the webinar discussion, I just want to cite a few housekeeping notes. We will, of course, be taking questions through the Q&A feature. and using the chat line only to communicate issues with the panelists or general comments. And I see already that folks have been able to communicate information to us. So I think that's well in hand. And we ask that instead of repeating question, the audience upvotes a question that they would like answered. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to our panelists, and I will ask each panelist to briefly introduce themselves. And I would like to start with Dr. Peter Marks. Peter.
Hi, thanks very much for having me today. Peter Marks. I was formerly director of Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research at FDA, where I was for about 13 years, and I'm currently the senior vice president at Eli Lilly and company working on genetic medicines and infectious disease products. My background is I'm trained as a hematologist oncologist. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Peter. Natasha.
Hi, everyone. I'm Natasha Kekri. I'm a hematologist oncologist in Canada. And what I bring to the panel is that I have been the clinical lead for a Made in Canada CAR T-cell therapy program for clinical trials, along with many other scientists and physicians across Canada.
Thank you. Patrick.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, CSPC and BioCanRx, for inviting me to participate. So I'm a regulatory professional with 20 years experience and a niche focus on cell and gene therapy. I'm currently the VP of Regulatory and Strategic Operations at Morphicell, which is a preclinical stage company based in Montreal, developing iPSC-derived ELTs, or encapsulated liver tissue, targeting acute liver failure. Previously worked at Health Canada for 10 years, supporting and leading their biosimilars, transplant guideline, and cell and gene therapy policies, and harmonizing requirements in Canada with FDA and EMA. And I was the founder of Weekend Reg Consulting Group, where I've supported dozens of Canadian startups and academics, and I've supported dozens of global companies interested in coming to Canada. So I volunteer a lot of time as well now at Creative Destruction Labs, other startups in Canada, where I see a lot of these startup companies. And I will be speaking from an industry and early startup regulatory perspective.
Thank you very much, Patrick. And Dr. Carmen Sanchez.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, and thank you for having me here today. I'm Carmen Sanchez. I'm a medical biotechnologist by training with a PhD in medical biotechnology and 7 years of industry experience in the global management of clinical trials and clinical translation. 6 years ago, I quit the company to join the cellular immunotherapy program led by Professor Michael Udecek at the University Clinic of Würzburg in Germany, where I've been appointed as a European Initiative Scientific Project Lead. I coordinated and supervised since then multiple European initiatives, among the others, the T2Evolve project, that it's a project that funded by the IHI, Innovative Health Initiative Funding Scheme, together with the European Commission, and that with the ambitious objective of optimizing the CAR and TCR technologies and increase their access across Europe. In January 2026, we established then as big outcome after the end of the project, the T2Evolve Association, a pan-European association that will support the same objective of the project, but in an expanded way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carmen. So as you can see, folks, we have a highly experienced panel that works at different points in the cell and gene therapy ecosystem. And I'd like to kick us off with obtaining opening statements from all of the panelists, with each panelist addressing the following question. And I'd like to kick it off with Natasha. From where you sit, Natasha, what are some of the critical translational questions or evidence gaps that must be addressed to help these advanced therapies reach the patients that need them?
So I come from the perspective of an academic developer in this space, right? I'm doing this with universities and people who are doing this at the side of their table. And the reality is that it's very exciting to see how this science has evolved, and the science is way outperforming where we are with getting these to patients, I think, right now. And that's the part that we really need to work on and fix. I think the evidence and the excitement is still there. I think we have many, many things that could potentially reach our patients, but they're just not getting there because of how complex this ecosystem is. And that's the part that I think we'll get into some of what those gaps are throughout this panel, but that's really where I'm seeing this as our critical spot right now.
Thank you, Natasha. Peter, would you be able to comment?
Yeah, thanks very much. So I'm going to echo the exact same thing. I think the science is absolutely amazing. And the more we learn about the potential for CRISPR-mediated technologies, it's breathtaking how much is possible. But translating that into actually making a difference in the lives of patients has been very challenging, both because of the challenges in scalable manufacturing, small-scale manufacturing for these populations, the clinical development challenges, getting the data to feel that we're confident that these products actually are going to work, and finally, figuring out how you pay for it all to actually have it be sustainable.
Thank you for that. Carmen, over to you.
Yeah, so this is a very broad question, in my opinion, but from the European perspective, I would say that I identified in the course of the years really a couple of major gaps, and they are not scientific, as we already said, but they are really a lack of community culture and a coordinated learning ecosystem. I think that the way we are collecting data and the way we really generate evidence that could be supporting questions from at multiple levels, HTA, regulatory, clinical implementation, are really still too fragmented. And especially for Europe, we really have country that generates and interprets evidence slightly differently. And this, of course, creates inefficiencies in terms of access. So we definitely have a lack of infrastructures that could systematically and continuously generate evidence, and also federated learning, because we need to learn from each other, and we really need to learn from these new therapies in a much more coordinated manner.
Thank you, Carmen. Over to you, Patrick.
Yeah, so I think I'm going to build on what Drs. Kekri and Marks said about the sciences there. And I just want to add to that and ask the two major questions that I see people struggle with. Is the data sufficiently relevant, and is it sufficiently reliable? And those are multi-million-dollar questions and many years delays if you get it wrong. So there's a lot of uncertainty about where those thresholds are. I think that's a major challenge in this field. And as a bonus question, I think we have to address is who's responsible for informing or addressing that, or gathering sufficient evidence in terms of quality and relevance and making that case. And I think a theme that we might have, and I hear in debate a lot, is how much should the regulator do? How much should developers do? Where do they meet in the middle? And I think that's where we're really going to struggle and probably have some disagreement.
Thank you, Patrick. I could not agree more. It's the subject of much discussion in Canada at the moment. So let's start with a question that grounds us in some patient realities in Canada. And Natasha, from the perspective of a clinician scientist who is both treating patients with commercial CAR T therapies that come from outside Canada and leading clinical development of made in Canada CAR Ts through the Canadian-led Immunotherapies Collaborative known as CLIC, can you comment on why you saw it as important to build a fully domestic CAR T program and what some of the challenges have been?
Yeah, so I mean, just to give a bit of background on where this came from, over a decade ago, I trained in Boston at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute in transplantation, bone marrow transplants and cell therapies, and CAR-T was getting a lot of excitement. We knew that approvals were imminent, and we knew that this therapy was going to really change the landscape of a lot of my leukemia and lymphoma patients that I see in the clinic, who would have access to these awesome new therapies. The reality was when I came back to Canada, we were not only not, it wasn't on the radar here, but we were still many years away from seeing that become a reality for our patients. And even now, with access to those commercial products, we are very, very behind the curve in terms of getting our patients access to them. And even when they do get approved in Canada, about 20% of our patients are reaching them. And that's because of Canadian specific issues, including our public healthcare system, our geography, many other things. So it was not really a hard question to ask or to try to build a Canadian platform for CAR-T therapies or cell therapies that's made by us, but also for the benefit of Canadians in an ecosystem that specifically speaks to the needs of our Canadian patients. And that's where that's where it came from, was really to build that. And we've now treated over 100 patients. We have 5 clinical trials in the pipeline. We have lots of great success. But getting these beyond those clinical trials is still going to be our biggest hurdle. And I think that while commercial products are here and they're here to stay, they are not getting us to the finish line for these patients in general. We're still dealing with response rates in the 30 to 40% range because we're dealing with old science when the new science hasn't reached the clinic yet. And so I think we have a long way to go. And I think that the pandemic was a very clear example of needing domestic manufacturing and independence. I think we've learned that in Canada. But more than that, we really have our own ecosystem and our own challenges that we would like to address with our Made in Canada programs.
Thank you very much for that. Very, very insightful about what the Canadian landscape looks like and what the reality is for patients. Peter, regulators are often seen as gatekeepers, but in cell and gene therapies, they're increasingly engaged across the development life cycle. From your perspective and many years of experience in FDA leadership overseeing these products, how can regulators evolve as active partners in translational research, helping shape evidence rather than simply evaluating it?
Yeah, and thanks so much for that question. I think this really is an interesting place for regulators today because they really do have a unique position being aware of the various research going on. Pace of research is incredibly rapid, although they can't share different programs with the different companies or academic institutions that come to them. They have that knowledge of what is going across the entire field. And because of that, they're in a unique position to help foster and move forward research in a way that nobody else can. I think that allows an enlightened regulator potentially to help move forward programs by helping to gently guide sponsors away from non-productive endeavors and help guide them toward ways of moving forward more rapidly. That is, if they're aware of other findings that that a sponsor might be trying to go down a path which is likely not to be productive, they can gently guide them away from that path without necessarily saying why, but they know why. I think that's an important function because, after all, we don't want people to be unnecessarily a part of experiments that are not going to be productive. And so regulators can help with that. They can help make sure the process stays as efficient as possible. And that efficiency is what's really critical to reducing the cost and improving the cycle time to getting products to those in need. So I view this as not, sometimes there's a criticism that can be launched that, well, regulators shouldn't be regulatory consultants for companies. I don't view that as a valid criticism. I think no, they're not regulatory consultants. I think regulators, though, can provide very valuable feedback that can prevent wasted time, wasted money, and most importantly, prevent patients from unnecessarily receiving something that's not going to ultimately be useful in product development, bringing benefit to people.
Thank you. I couldn't agree more with respect to, really the support of the ecosystem and making it work as efficiently as possible. Patrick, did you want to comment?
Yeah, so I agree there's an important role for regulators and going to the FDA for interact meetings or pre-IND meetings or at Health Canada for pre-CTA meetings informally or pre-CTA meetings is extremely helpful in de-risking strategies. Um, there's a balance though in my mind that I'm happy to take a bit of the other side, which is there's inherent problems in over reliance on regulators. That's where we might get some agreement in middle ground. A lot of the companies that I speak with, spinning out of Canadian institutions, or people coming from other places to Canada, want to ask some very basic regulatory questions because they've not yet completed their homework or understand the framework or haven't established their own risk-based approach. And when they ask the wrong questions to regulators, they get the wrong answers. Regulators, and particularly I'd say in Canada, there might be a difference in Canada versus US, where Canadian regulators, many of them have never worked in industry or thought of drug development from a company's perspective and a company's reality. And getting the advice from a group too early and without preparing about what you should do to develop your product or developing your plan too much might create unrealistic expectations, might be kill a budget, might not reflect your early stage reality. So there is an element of there's a role to play, but if we get it to be too much, there will be a problem. And the final thing, and this is most compelling for me, the more people who come early and come often, the longer everybody else waits. 10 years ago, I could get a Health Canada person on the phone in a couple of weeks and have a pre-submission meeting in less than their 3-month target. Last year, I waited over 6 months for them to respond to a pre-submission request. We can overwhelm them with bad questions, or I shouldn't say bad questions, with questions that aren't yet fully fleshed out and haven't been developed by the people who are supposed to be the experts, who I believe are the drug developers.
Thank you, Patrick. Carmen, I saw that your hand was raised.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But I can only echo what Patrick said. However, I think, this balance is absolutely needed. And this is something that we see increasingly also in Europe, where the developers, so academic developers, are investing time and resources in learning the language of the regulators. Exactly, because they want to do their own work and they want to do the right questions. But this is really supported by the fact that they have a vision for their programs, for their development programs. On the other hand, what we see really in Europe increasingly is that the regulators are not just evaluators, but they are co-shapers of the ecosystem and the evidence framework. So, and this dialogue is really increasingly making things much more, I wouldn't say flexible, but smoother in a way the developers approach the regulatory dialogue. So, also, additionally, I would say the EMA at the European level, but also at the national level, they promoted programs for informal consultation that are really meant to have an open dialogue and an open understanding of where the field is going. And this is what, for example, they are doing with the Quality Innovation Group Forum or the Innovation Task Force at the EMA. On a national level, also the Paul Ehrlich Institute, for example, is promoting consultations that are really facilitating also and encouraging this open dialogue. I would say that this is absolutely key. to promote that and to promote innovation across Europe. On the other hand, what I find really interesting on the European landscape is the fact that through bigger European initiatives like IHI projects, so innovative health initiatives projects, the pre-competitive collaboration between the multi-stakeholders, the different stakeholders in the field is absolutely key, and it's also encouraging this regulatory dialogue on an early stage. Because early stage, what does that mean? It's really that stage where we can really put forward evidence frameworks that will help facilitate the approval path on the long run. So this is fundamental. And this is what we are now seeing in Europe mainly.
That is excellent and an excellent synopsis. And Natasha, yes, please.
I mean, I think this is great. We've heard, what the perspective could be from a regulator who's very experienced. We've heard the perspective of, I think, strong collaborations as we're hearing for Europe. I think Canada's just not there yet. I think while we are struggling with how to bring these into the clinic, we also are not having enough conversations collaboratively to figure this out together. So I think that is right now, as someone who has done the homework, a team that's done the homework of figuring out what the regulations currently look like, what manufacturing looks like, I am very happy to meet the bar that is already there. But what I am struggling with is that we cannot have ongoing conversations with regulators who are seeing much more volume than I'm seeing, because I'm coming from one group of people who believe in certain things with the science. The regulator, as Peter said, has seen multiple applications from multiple different sectors. And there's value there. And I think in Canada, right now, everything I'm doing is for the regulator, not with the regulator. And in Canada, that doesn't work because our ecosystem is all public funded. It's public dollars with public access as a very important mandate of our Canada healthcare system. And we haven't created a system where the regulator can be part of that ecosystem. The regulator, while their job is, of course, patient safety and making sure what we do is ethical and safe, they can play a role in cell and gene therapy specifically in helping to get these things to the finish line. And I want to be clear, I'm not trying to lower the bar for any of the requirements. I'm just trying to make sure that we can do this in a more streamlined process, because while Stephanie showed that beautiful slide, that is probably very underestimating in Canada how this is going in the cell and gene therapy space. And so I think that's where Canada sits right now, unfortunately.
Those are excellent points, and I've written down your sentence of for the regulator, not with the regulator, as really key. And it's and what I'm hearing from both Peter and Carmen is the criticality of the criticality of understanding the role that they play in innovation, not just in regulating product, right? To be able to support innovators in translating their products forward. Patrick, I want to follow up with a question to you on the regulatory aspects and a term that is very often used, and in particular, really often used in Canada. So we often hear that regulatory barriers are preventing advanced therapies from getting to patients in Canada. Would you be able to unpack this and demystify that for us?
I can try. So I agree. I hear this term a lot, regulatory barrier. The other term, it's a bit of a euphemism, is regulatory uncertainty. And both of them, I understand where people are coming from and the frustration and the commendable desire to speed things up. But I think this term is getting too much traction and becoming a scapegoat. We definitely have to dig deeper. So I'll break down how I understand it and then maybe end off with an opinion that can be discussed. So when people say they hit a regulatory barrier, that can mean two things. They can mean that regulations themselves prevent us from moving forward in Canada, and I'll focus on Canada. And I think that's blatantly false. So I spent a decade at Health Canada trying to find the line in the food and drug regulations that would stop cell and gene therapy from moving forward, and it simply doesn't exist. I've also looked for it outside of government, supporting clients as a consultant, and then as part of two startups, and I also didn't find it. So I shouldn't say they don't exist. I haven't found it in 20 years, and maybe someone smarter than me or experience something different. Love to hear from them. But let's assume that the performance-based requirements that say you need to manufacture under sanitary conditions and you can't misrepresent your product and you have to make sure the benefits outweigh the risks is not the barrier. There still is a problem that people are experiencing. So that can come down to convincing regulators that you've done enough. So it's the regulatory narrative around your product. And the term regulatory barrier uncertainty is probably from someone who experienced a very negative decision that they didn't agree with. But the concept of saying it's a regulatory barrier or uncertainty is lumping all of the blame on the listener. I would say the only productive way of looking at a regulatory barrier or uncertainty is we failed to develop a sufficient narrative backed up by evidence to convince a regulator who also wants patients to be treated, who wants the benefits to outweigh the risks, and will look at it and be a third party to assess whether you've done sufficient information. If they disagree with you, then we fail, and I'll say myself, then we fail to convince the regulator. We share that blame. Using the term regulatory barrier is much too basic. I think we need to examine it more, and we have to turn around and say who is not meeting the regulatory expectation and how. And I don't think we'll find out it's 100% a barrier put up by regulators. We have a joint failure to agree on what evidence is sufficient to show that benefits outweigh the risk. The scapegoat is not productive, and it's going to hold things up, and people will argue and appeal and just take more time. Maybe a collaborative approach, as Dr. Kekri is suggesting, can help iron that out and having additional discussions. But I've seen where some of those lead, and they lead to new regulations. Might surprise people to hear we have 2 brand new regulations that have been around since like 2020 or earlier. They've never been used. It's because they don't have to be, and that's the problem. Now, if the question is, can we optimize it specifically for a pathway? Absolutely. Is that important from a global competitive perspective? Yes. That's a different question. Let's get off regulatory barrier and say it doesn't need to be broke, doesn't need to be fixed, but is there a better way? That's a useful discussion.
Thank you for that, Patrick. I'm sure that there are going to be comments from the other panelists on this webinar. Do you care to share your views on what Patrick has just said? Natasha, Peter, or Carmen?
Maybe I'll let Peter go first, and then I'll talk about Canada.
I look. I think there is a bit of right. It's always easy to blame the regulator. And it's obviously an ecosystem. The product development is an ecosystem where I think ideally, you have product developers doing their best to put forward their best efforts to respond to existing regulatory guidance, regulations, and do their best. Unfortunately, sometimes there are challenges, and it is true, it's easy to say that it's the regulator that's causing the problem. But I would say this, I do not believe that, and I'll just speak for an opinion about the US, I don't believe that we've figured out how to modernize our regulation of genetic therapies from what we were doing in the 1980s and 1990s for small molecules and protein therapeutics. And I think that there is probably a fundamentally different way we're going to have to go about regulating genetic medicines, that is gene therapies, mRNAs, et cetera, if we are going to be able to effectively address literally tens of thousands of variants that we're going to see, be that thousands of rare diseases, tens of thousands of genetic variants that go along with them or more. And so I think there is some challenge here to the regulator as well to try to do it better. And we haven't found that yet, totally. And I think we're trying to find our footing. And if we don't find that footing, what we're going to see is other countries will start to find that footing for us other than the United States, Canada, and Europe.
Thank you, Peter. Fantastic observations.
And I think, Steph, that really is the opinion of many of these academic developers like myself, is that the regulations exist. To Patrick's point, they're there. I can find them, but they're not necessarily adaptive for what I'm trying to accomplish. So let me give you a couple examples. Stability testing on lentivirus, which is an important component to CAR T-cell therapies. I think that's hugely important. We need to be able to show our virus is stable. But do I need to be able to show that in a phase 1 first in human where my trial will end within 1 to 2 years? I'm not sure of the value in that specific situation. Now, it's there because if I want to keep developing, I agree with that. But when virus is incredibly expensive to manufacture, I will lose many vials to the purposes of stability. I will have to make more virus upfront for a phase 1 that is not de-risked. I don't know what's going to happen in that first in human trial. So that's an example of, are we being risk adaptive in that approach? When I know what the stability requirements are of my regulator, are we being risk adaptive? Another example is, as anyone who knows anything about our CLIC program knows, that we're trying to build a point of care or distributed manufacturing program. We have done everything per the regulators' requirements in terms of showing comparability between one site and the new one that comes along. But these are still phase 1, early human trials. And now I'm being asked to create functional characteristics related to that CAR T product, something that's never been required of me on any of the phase 1 trials that we run. Now, when I add a second manufacturing site, I have functional requirements for those to show functionality of the product, things like a potency assay. And again, while I completely see the value in building these programs with our regulator, at the phase 1 stage where we are still learning about these products, it is a very big hurdle for academics to get anywhere with that phase 1 trial, to build the knowledge to then build a real phase 2, because we get stuck. We don't have barriers, to Patrick's point, but we get stuck in trying to build these requirements in to then get these to patients. And so I do think, just to both what Patrick and Peter said, I agree with everything said, that I think there has to be some change and happy medium where we come together a little bit more. And I think, our Canadian way is to build things together. I don't know why this has to be any different.
And if I can add on to that. So I love that you brought up a specific example, Natasha, and I think a lot of people who haven't had the experience you have struggle to bring up that kind of example. But I'd encourage people to look back, for example, at the expectation of stability studies and look at what it says actually in the regulations. And I haven't looked at this one in particular in years, but I'm familiar with the issue. And I don't think that the regulations are prescriptive enough to say what's required, which means that it's left to guidance, if it's even in guidance. And it probably is, but that guidance probably exempts cell and gene therapies and speaks specifically to pharmaceuticals or biologics, or refers to international ICH guidelines. Those guidelines are helpful. They're intended, and the problem then is we're getting around a regulator's expectation, which is going to my point of the regulations aren't the problem, convincing the regulator is. And so there are many groups that have struggled to convince regulators to come around to their way of thinking and what seems reasonable, given a specific product in a specific clinical context. And that's where we're failing. And it's not a need for a new framework, although maybe that would be very helpful. And it's not a need for new regulations. It's a need for, how do we convince them properly? And we can learn how to do that. And how do we get them to listen more? And there's ways that that can happen. So that's maybe what we need to focus on, is my main point. Because I think there's a lot of people who struggle with a lot of these examples, and maybe there's common learnings, but how to do it and what to do. The last thing I want to see is to throw out the baby with the bathwater and start over. I mean, monoclonal antibodies figured out how to use old pharmaceutical and then developed for biotech, and now these newer things 20, 30 years ago, and they didn't require regulatory change, but now there's specific guidance and expectations have changed. How do we evolve that more quickly should be the question. And part of it is convincing regulators to think differently, to be more open to these evidence-based rationale. But from my experience, they are pretty open. So that's maybe where I'm biased by my experiences in knowing how to put forward these cases. And part of my challenge is there are a lot of other professionals like me. I mean, I'm looking at some of the list of the people who are attending this conference, and they have lots of experience in this space. But the reality is a lot of academic early startups might struggle to afford to pay for those groups. Some of them are in consulting companies, some of them are established professionals. So I'm not saying it's easy, but we need to dedicate time and effort and realize our reality and start working within it and funding for it, because not all of our research money should go directly to the scientists in the labs. A lot of it needs to support these translational things like developing your regulatory narrative and strategically figuring out how to convince regulators.
Excellent points, Patrick. On that, with respect to engaging the regulator and doing that kind of necessary work, and you've stated that there's an openness, but sometimes implementation is the issue. And I think that groups like T2 Evolve, are key, and groups like BioCanRx also are key to those types of engagements, really on the policy front and really looking forward to implementation. On that, Carmen, I wanted to ask you a question. Thinking about Canada and Europe, both Canada and Europe face fragmentation across jurisdictions. This complicates clinical development and access. You have led T2 Evolve, a large European initiative that I've just mentioned that aim to address this. And so, why is collaboration and harmonization of evidence requirements and data collection so important for cell and gene therapy access?
Okay, so thank you very much. Indeed, this has been one of the major objectives for the T2 Evolve project back then, and what we are carrying on with the T2 Evolve Association. Because of course, this is a dynamic effort that we need to support, right? It's nothing that will set in stones. I can tell you, first of all, what we have supported with the T2 Evolve at the beginning of the project was really meant to harmonize technical gaps that we identified in the field across Europe. And this was spanning from the preclinical, advanced preclinical models that were used across Europe for a better prediction of the outcome of the therapy, safety, toxicity. But also we wanted to harmonize in terms of immunomonitoring, analytical processes, and anything that could really potentially really generate knowledge that could be used for evidence generation for these therapies across Europe. What we realized was really the fact that in the different countries, besides the technical differences, there was a big, huge difference also in the way the data were collected. Each country in Europe has a very strong assets. We have very strong networks. We have national-based networks, and then we have national registries that are collecting and trying to address different questions in a different way. But this makes comparability across countries really, really difficult to achieve. And so one of the major efforts that we supported with the T2 Evolve project was really to create infrastructures for federated learning and harmonize core data sets across the different data registries that could facilitate instead this comparability and this knowledge loop from the real world evidence back to the bench and vice versa, right? So that's what we have done. We achieved that by already omoping, this is the technical term, the database of the National Registry in Austria for the CAR-T therapy. And we were quite proud of this because this was a major effort. Mapping was a kind of translating what the data registry was already collecting in an infrastructure that is called common data model, that could be talking with other databases with the same common data model, and basically learn from each other without having the data sitting in one unique place, but still sitting in their own databases, but yet able to answer research questions in an aggregate manner. And we are expanding this kind of effort across Europe. And this is absolutely what I was talking about at the beginning of the webinar, really promoting this community responsibility in terms of data generation and collection and reusability. Data interoperability,
Yes.
what we call it. And this is also something that we are promoting by really collecting consensus around the core data set, CAR-T core data set. Now, of course, this is something that you cannot keep static. So this is something that we will keep updating along the course of the Tito Valve Association work, for sure, for which we have a working group that is really dedicated to that, and multiple experts in the field for different indications, because the CAR-T therapy is expanding beyond the hematological malignancies. So we will also embrace the autoimmune disease and other indications that are upcoming. So really to allow this shared learning about the technology. And with the final opportunity really to promote and to support access, evidence generation for promoting access, equitable access across Europe.
Thank you for this, and yes, outstanding work has been done and carried out by T2 Evolve on this front. Are there any comments with respect to data interoperability, a term subject that's very much on the minds of a number of different organizations here in Canada as we seek to better mobilize, utilize a lot of the data that we create and here in Canada in our individual provinces. But I'm wondering, with respect to this question on fragmentation across jurisdictions, complicating clinical development and access, whether there are comments from the other panelists. Yes, Peter.
So I mean, I look, this has been an area of great interest of mine for a decade, which is that in the rare disease area, it seems like we, as individual countries, are creating barriers that maybe we like them there for large products, for products that have large markets. But when it has to do with access for what often amounts to maybe dozens or less of patients, we have these barriers in place with individual requirements which make it difficult to have a file move from one jurisdiction to another. And to the extent that we could agree, even as a pilot for rare diseases, to come up with something that would be a truly uniform common technical document type of approach that would be simplified, that could move easily from one place to another, or if we could have something that were the equivalent of what we have for vaccines with WHO, with pre-qualifications to make it easy to get access, it might really help with some of the issues. That's for further along in development. I get it, but I think we need to try to remove as many barriers in this area as we can, because that's preventing some of the investigation earlier on, knowing that the barriers to actually getting something across the finish line are as high as they are.
Thank you. Patrick?
Just a quick note, because when we get too detailed, I lose my area of expertise, so in data management. But from a harmonization of requirements or data perspective, that's one area Canada actually excels at. I've seen Health Canada tell people just cut and paste your US submission or EU submission. Quality overall summaries are different in EU versus FDA oftentimes in the level of detail and what falls into the Module 3 documents and details. Health Canada is very open to harmonizing with other jurisdictions. In fact, I think to a problematic point, they've made a point of harmonizing with major global jurisdictions. So I think there will be a lot of traction if someone wants to encourage Health Canada to do more harmonization. Seems to be one of their major strategies is to make us globally competitive, is to accept high standards, but the same standards as other jurisdictions. It's their go-to move.
Thank you, Patrick. Yes, Natasha.
So just to push back on that, Patrick, do you think it has limited then our independence in thinking when it comes to regulating cell and gene therapies if we are able to easily harmonize and use what other regulators are doing?
It's a really good question, and I think they've walked the line pretty carefully. I think they've maintained their credibility. They started by becoming a full member of ICH and working on standards there. They've worked strategically on projects like Orbis and these other regulatory review sharing, but they've maintained their decision-making capability. They've also taken some decisions that other regulators haven't by preventing certain products from moving forward because of safety risks and by being a little more brave and leading the world in some early approvals where other regulators wanted to wait for additional data. So I think they've actually walked the line very carefully and personally, I think properly to maintain credibility, but still be harmonized and rely on other jurisdictions. The only criticism I have is over reliance on that move. The best that harmonization can do, if that's your only move to compete globally, is to be an add-on country, not a leader. So you fit yourself into a US strategy because they're the largest market and that's where people want to go, or you fit yourself. Talking about the second gap that Stephanie talked about at the beginning, when we look at that second gap for commercialization and adoption, we're an add-on at best right now because we're not better, faster, cheaper. We're not significantly de-risked, but we kind of fit. If you want to go from EU to North America, you can start here or start in US, but it's pretty easy, relatively speaking. And if you're in the US and you want to start thinking globally, Canada's a decent place to go because of harmonization. I just want to add on to it.
Thank you. And I'm really glad that you used that term faster, better, cheaper, which is a fantastic segue to my next question. We have seen incredible results emerging from China. I believe that last year, some incredible percentage of deals were hailing from China, where 30% of licensing deals by big pharma, large biotechs were actually of technologies that are Chinese origin. Whereas in, just 10 years ago, that percentage would have dropped down to close to zero. So obviously, great deal of investment in China by the Chinese government, and a really great deal of sophistication there being expressed. So my question for the members of the panel is the following. China's acceleration of cell and gene therapy development, and I would also add to this, and that's very much on a country that's on everybody's minds here in Canada, Australia's emergence as a destination for early phase clinical trials are frequent topics of discussion. Can you provide insights into why CGT product developers are choosing China or Australia for early phase clinical activities, and how other countries can learn from these approaches to become more competitive in supporting CGT innovation? Who would like to kick us off with this? Yes, Peter.
I'm happy to start. So I think this is a case where I think the key word that we have to talk about is balance. I think we need to look at what is going on in Australia and China, realize what they're doing well and what we want to try to adopt. And also, though, realize what we have that we don't want to let go of and come to a balance that may lead us to something that ultimately gives us increased speed with retention of the kind of safety that we've come to appreciate. Just because something bad hasn't happened yet in the past year or two, since we've seen the move towards China and Australia, doesn't mean that it won't occur. That's not a threat. It's just a comment that one of the things that has happened, the reason why obviously developers are liking China and Australia is because when you don't have a very rigorous need for the preclinical or manufacturing data, and it's a little different in Australia. It's perhaps less on the manufacturing. In China, it's both manufacturing and the weight of preclinical data that's required because it's an IRB-based process, an ethics committee-based process, rather than a regulator-based process for many of the investigator-initiated trials. The speed of getting into the clinic is much faster. And what seems to be a current trend in the US is just go to China, find out if something's going to work or not, de-risk it. And you can always do another phase 1 in the United States once you, with the correct or more, I shouldn't say correct, that's judgmental, sorry, with the more robust preclinical package that you would normally need. And so I think this has become a challenge because ideally, I think there is probably some minimal amount of preclinical data that we should have before a human sees a product. And there's probably also some degree of manufacturing quality that should be present before a human sees a product. And I think if we could find a way of getting there more efficiently, both in terms of time and cost, at least in the US, I think we would probably not have this large sucking sound towards Australia and China. It's not a criticism of Australia or China, and it's also not even a criticism of the US. It's about finding some happy medium that actually does facilitate development at the kind of pace that today's competitive environment requires, while retaining the safety controls that prevent something really bad from happening. And remember, we're trying to prevent stuff in regulation that it's not going to necessarily happen with, very frequently, but you just don't want a disaster even that happens once in a long time. I'm thinking about, why, for instance, some of the regulations we have in place or some of what we do in terms of dose escalation is in place. And it's because 2 decades ago, there were some issues where somebody tried to dose escalate in one day and there were disasters that occurred. So it's finding that happy medium in between.
Thank you. I couldn't agree more. And I like to refer to Australia as because it seems as if it's an overnight success story, but it's actually a 30-year overnight success story where they wanted to attract, they were not seeing the drug launches that they wanted to obtain in their country and wanted to attract early stage trials to benefit their patients, and made very conscious decisions to fill the gaps, right? Take a look at the ecosystem and fill the gaps, and have realized these incredible results that we're seeing now. Patrick.
Yeah, so I'm a little bit discouraged in talking to a lot of very early stage companies. I'm talking even at conferences at how people are developing their global regulatory strategies. I think we're giving a lot of them too much credit. I think the number one thing driving global regulatory strategies is rhetoric. So we've heard the different stories. I've been around this field for a long time. There were a lot of reasons, and then some of them are good, but I think the driving force is the rhetoric to go to Japan for their Sakigake process in cell and gene therapy. Australia was 5 to 10 years ago in medical devices, and it's resurging now because investors and early stage companies see an ability to get into first in human studies very quickly. China really rose in the last 2, 3 years in doing this and making regulatory changes and welcoming people. There are meaningful changes these groups are making. There are reasons for companies to go there, and there is a potential very good global strategy that says maybe start there. But I'm one of those people who thinks the number one reason is because there's a story behind it. And remember, most of the companies, when they're making these early stage global regulatory strategies, don't have sophisticated regulatory people developing their strategies. They get some consultants, they talk to people, they hear stories, and what they need to do is tell a story to suspend disbelief for investors. And they're kind of fantasy stories. They're saying, I think I can treat this. I don't have all the data yet. And I think this regulatory pathway will give me an advantage. I'll be there 6 months, a year faster. And they don't know any of that. They probably don't even know specifics about the regulatory pathway, but they need to tell those stories to get money. So I think if we dig deeper, there are very important things that we should consider when we think about global regulatory strategy. And I'd say that two most important things are, can you get your data in there to do the study and satisfy regulators, because otherwise you're breaking the law. So that's the barrier. And number two is, can you get meaningful data out of there that can be used to support studies elsewhere and to justify sophisticated investors that you've de-risked the product because you got meaningful data. Those are the two real reasons that we should make global regulatory strategies. And I think we're failing in Canada right now to hype Canadian submissions. We do a great job with high quality regulators, as I mentioned before. We have great science, we have great institutions, we have a diverse population. These are good reasons to come here. We also have very portable data. You do your study here, and we have mutual recognition agreements with the EU and with other people. There are a lot of good reasons. What we lack is a good story. And I'm really passionate about this. I end up being quite animated because I think we're horribly failing in that department. When you look at the second valley of debt that you have, the US has an accelerated approval based on surrogate endpoints and high quality data and based on unmet need. Guess what? We do too. Do we sell it with an accelerated pathway? No, we call it conditional. We pass on a hot potato problem to our payers and to our health tech assessors and say, this isn't good enough for normal approval. We'll call it conditional. I'm not kidding when I say it actually is important that it sounds better. Getting early designations, fast track,
Yes.
RMAT, all of these things, they're meaningful in the US because you can take that as a value inflection point to an investor and say, a regulator who's well respected thinks highly of this and is going to help us along the way. What do we have in Canada? Nothing. And I'm sorry, but I've been advocating for this for a while, and it's just abjectly missing. And it's making it very hard to compete against China, Australia, Japan. US and EU have market size. What do we have? Harmonization. We need more. We need a designated pathway specifically for that. And when we talk about these other large initiatives, like our task force to address major problems like most favored nation, and you're just attacking that with a shield, it does not work.
Thank you. Thank you, Patrick. A very passionate response indeed. Carmen or Natasha?
I just wanted to comment on what Patrick said, because I think that this again goes back to the regulatory dialogue. I know in Europe this is already happening, and developers that are investing outside Europe, they are already in a continuous dialogue or in a proactive dialogue with regulators to understand how to better reuse data collected and generated from clinical trials outside Europe. And they call it as a kind of de-risk package, right? So provided that, for example, CMC follows European standards, and that's a must. So there are some criteria for which we can actually we will be able to reuse data from clinical trials outside. But again, this is really a co-shaping of the system that needs to happen. And this can only happen when the developers have a regulatory strategy and really invest into regulatory resources, people that can really help them putting forward the right global strategy, most of the cases, right, that could facilitate a fast approval pathway. So I totally agree with Patrick on that.
Thank you.
I think Patrick just defended my not for the regulator, should be with the regulator, because to Patrick's point,
Yes.
while the regs are there, those pathways in Canada are not broadcast, nor does the regulator bring it to the academic developer. If I go up to Health Canada and say, I want to do X, Y, and Z, Health Canada can say yes or no. But if they say no, and they know that there is something that can benefit me, would it not make sense to say no, but why don't you think of it this way? And to Peter said this, right? You can't tell them exactly what someone else has done, but you can direct people. And in my opinion, in my experience, don't get that from our regulator, despite the fact that it probably is there. And so I do think, to Carmen's point, it's again back to that piece about collaboration and dialogue that we just aren't there yet in Canada, unfortunately. And I think we can get there because, again, we all work under one ecosystem with one public healthcare system with one mandate. There's no reason we can't work together to fix this. So I keep saying that too. And again, we have these solutions probably. Some of them are already there, and yet we don't have the ability to really work with those solutions as they exist. So I do think we need to work on that.
I knew we agreed deep down, Natasha. We just had to find out exactly what it is. And let's just refine it and say we have to be careful what we wish for and ask for. And there is a useful, important role that regulators need to play. And my perspective is a little further over of I don't know that they have the amount of experience that we always expect in novel spaces. Innovative medicines, if we wait for regulators to tell us, then we're waiting 5-10 years too late, and the people who are moving ahead, without waiting for the regulators, are going to have our lunch. I think we have to involve them, but
Yes.
not wait for them.
Yes, yes. And there was the Canada's Drug Agency conference yesterday was last week, I meant, not yesterday, but last week was the launch of the watch list, which is really, looking ahead, looking forward to what is coming down the pipe. And it was really informative. And I had the opportunity to speak on that with Kate Murray from the Stem Cell Network about what this watch list looks like. And I found it to be a really good exercise and perhaps one that should be followed by our regulator as well. You've touched on this a little bit, Patrick, but I would like to open it up in particular to Natasha and to Patrick. And before I get to the audience questions, and really quickly, Canada is not a preferred jurisdiction for CGT clinical development and product launch. And what would it take for us to become one?
I'll start, Patrick. Patrick already said it. I think we don't have the experience as a regulator here to grow this faster. I think we do rely a little bit on what others have done. But I think we can get that experience, right? We have people here who are very experienced in the Canadian ecosystem in this regard. And I think perhaps the people that I've noticed more recently at BRDD, for example, that we're hiring are not necessarily people who have the experience behind it. So they're learning with every CTA that comes in the door, which is great. But then we need to keep those people and grow that experience. We just don't have that. And so to become a preferred nation for something like this, we have to lead in it. But to lead in it, we have to know where we came from, and we don't have that yet.
And I'll actually step outside of my regulatory area and hat. A lot of the work I've been doing has been earlier stage and supporting strategies and trying to be a Canadian advocate. I'm obviously passionate about it, but the story I tell might be different than a story another person tells. The efforts that one group's making might not be aligned to the other. In my mind, the most important thing is we have to have a common voice, a common narrative, a global pitch that we can do. There's all the elements are there, I believe. We do have a way of developing clinical products better, faster, and cheaper, or some combination of that. That's very desirable. But we don't have, I mean, Australia came out and published one in cell and gene therapy about how you can align these things and how they plan to compete globally. They talk about the price of things, they talk about the speed of things, they talk about alignment. We don't have that common voice yet. And I think everybody's waiting for somebody to do it. And I think also, and remember, there's a demographic of our audience, and a huge demographic of our audience are investors. And I don't think that having, rightly or wrongly, I don't think that having a bureaucratic lead for that sounds very enticing. I wonder if we want a joint initiative led by industry that says, this is why you should come to Canada. 75% cheaper clinical trial, if that's actually the data, and I don't think it's far off. If you want to work with regulatory consultants, it's 1/2 the price compared to going to the US. If you want to get your trial approved and REB approved, tell them what it looks like in Canada and figure out if we can compete. And as we go through developing that pathway, we'll see where things stick out and don't fit, and then we can work on them. So I think it's actually worthwhile to put together the Why Canada pitch and look at it. And when we talk about this task force and looking at global factors and how Canada wants to compete, maybe we're at the right time to put that together too. There's the willingness, there should be, if we want to compete in life sciences. Remember, there were economic tables back in 2015 or something like that saying that Canada wants to compete in life sciences and specifically in cell and gene therapies. That's a great dream, but without putting the plan together, we have, and people are doing the right thing. There is good science. People, CIHR is investing in it. Stem cell therapy, BioCanRx, there's a lot of it going on. Nobody's aligning it properly.
Yeah, and speaking of alignment, right, going back to the Australia example, it's also carrying out the work that needs to be done, the clinical trial, but it's also marrying it with economic incentives and tax schemes, right? So it's really combining both, and linking the economics to the health benefits to their population. I'm turning it over to the questions that are in the Q&A, and I'm going to the question that's been upvoted. And the question reads as follows. How do you see the new Health Canada Advanced Therapeutic Product, or also known as the ATP pathway, supporting the approval of academic CGTs in the future? So lots of hands. Yes. Natasha or Patrick? Who wants to go first? Okay, Patrick.
So I was really excited when this was developed. Remember, it was developed 2016 to 17, 18. There was a Cross Canada Roadshow. The branch level plan for developing this framework was very exciting. They did listen. There was a What We Heard report. There were 5 technologies identified as likely candidates for being listed on Schedule G, and therefore being able to have the legislative authority to decide which regulatory frameworks to apply or to adopt other global ones. It was a magic wand of regulatory effort. Then it went to the Biologics and Radiopharmaceutical Drugs Directorate, where it died a slow death and nobody's declared it yet. It's been around, I'm sorry, but if you develop a thing for innovative medicine 7 years ago and we haven't seen something through it, you've had 7 years of dead products that are going through frameworks that aren't customized for it. This was an abject failure in my perspective, and I'm sorry about being so negative, but this is a framework well intended. It However, and I can even tell you, and I think I submitted this on behalf of 4 institutions when they got their 20 comments, and I did an access to information request to see how they listened to all of the input into this framework. But it was unfortunately interpreted by regulators to say, if something's broken, then we'll apply this framework. That means that regulators are using it exclusively to solve a problem where the regulations are broken. They haven't found it yet, going to my original point. It's not being used to optimize things, and it's being applied late stage. Once you have all of the data in a clinical study, come to us and get into our regulatory sandbox. Who in their right mind will invest in a product at early stages in development when you have no idea but a vague promise that will adapt regulations at the end? This, I mean,
Goes to that regulatory uncertainty piece,
yes,
right?
yes.
Yes,
And the worst part is we now have a second framework. So we have precision medicine. I'm super interested to see how that's interpreted, but we already had a set of regulations that could have applied. So this is an example where maybe it's can serve a purpose, but it's solving a regulator's problem. We need to adopt this and encourage regulators to help solve our problems, which are get investors excited about the product you're developing, help us make sure that we're developing it properly, and that starts with the end in mind. If the end is a magic wand, I don't think any investor is going to want to use it. I'd love to be proven wrong, but this framework bothers me at this point. Not the conception, but how it's being used.
Thank you, Patrick.
So,
Natasha.
thanks, Patrick. I mean, the question really was, does the ATP pathway, how could it support the approval of CGTs? And the answer is it will not, as Patrick just said. And the reality is that we did try. So Health Canada did have a consult related to cell and gene therapies, CAR T specifically, related to could this be part of ATP? But to Patrick's point, all the wrong people were at the table. All the wrong people from Health Canada were at the table. And unfortunately, it just led to, well, we know regs exist, which is exactly what Patrick's been saying. This was not created in an ecosystem to help move these things further. It was just a checkbox to say, does it meet the ATP requirement? It did not. And therefore, we have no ability to go back to the table and tell them, well, there's still lots we could have done with the people you had at the table. So I do think it was a very lost opportunity. It's very sad that the wrong people were at the table. I think asking industry partners who already have approved commercial products in this country is not a group that is motivated to improve on the development if they're not bringing other therapies to Canada to be developed. Asking FACT-accredited transplant programs that do not fall under the same regulations under Health Canada to be part of the discussion of how to regulate more than minimally manipulated products, not the right people. So the only people at the table who were beating this drum was BioCanRx and myself. And the problem with that is that everyone knows our program and what we're trying to develop. And it's not about our program, it's about the Canadian ecosystem. And that messaging was completely lost. So I am equally frustrated, like Patrick, that unfortunately that is a very lost opportunity for us to discuss with our regulator. And, no matter what, I really have said in Europe and in the US, there is so many better pathways to even just talk to the regulator. Forget about changing things, just having dialogue. And we still do not have that.
Thank you. Thank you both. We're going to go to the next audience question with the highest upvotes. And the question is, what do you see as specific changes that need to happen to adapt current regulations to address the nuances of CGTs?
I'm happy to take a stab, at least in a thought. Which is that this is not going to be a broad brush for all CGT products, but there are certain products for which one could envision that a process-based approval could be possible. Places where the manufacturing, if it's buttoned down to be the same process every time, and if there are appropriate controls in place, to make sure, for instance, that you're not getting undesirable off-target effects, which you can do in silico and in cell culture, that you might be able to, for instance, find a way that if you wanted to manufacture a genome editor for metabolic liver diseases, rather than coming back for each specific liver disease and each specific guide difference, you would basically have a process-based approval because you're going to use the same lipid nanoparticle, the same basic CRISPR construct. You're just going to change the guide on the prime editor, for instance, each time. That maybe you could find a way here to be able to treat a bunch of different diseases with a process-based approval for genetic medicine rather than an individual product. I mean, it is a product, right? It's a liver, a CRISPR-Cas prime editor for metabolic diseases of the liver. But instead of having it be for each specific one with a label for each specific one, you would have something more general. I think that's the kind of thinking. That may not be, there may be refinements necessary on that, but that's the way I think we're going to have to start thinking if we want to make the kind of progress that we'd like to see. And as I say, it's not going to be applicable for every genetic medicine, every cell therapy, because some of these products have such idiosyncratic toxicities that you're not going to be able to take that kind of an approach. But where we can, we should, at least in my opinion.
Absolutely. Yeah. And this goes back on how you reuse the data, how you collect the data, how you integrate your data, and how you reuse the data, right? And this is, again, something that we should really discuss with the regulators in the most constructive way. Here in Europe, for example, with the last funding round, we had defined topics for the course, and some of them were really related to support systematic collection and reuse of the data, preclinical or CMC, clinical, and how we really integrate them and how we make them available for cross-reference and for extrapolation. And this is absolutely important. Now we are also supporting the platform technology approach here in Europe. This is, again, something that could and should facilitate the leverage of prior knowledge and the process knowledge that we have. Absolutely agree with you, Peter.
It's really.
If
Yes,
I can
please,
build
Patrick.
on
Yeah.
what both Dr. Marks and Sangha said. So I think in Canada specifically, we can, the most exciting things that I see coming out of the US FDA right now, the most promising are platform designations and plausible mechanism. The first one applying, I think, very appropriately to closed system manufacturing would be extremely helpful, and special pathways for that. I think that will really help a lot of cell therapies. I think there's a lot of new technologies coming out of there. Put in machine learning, AI, the rest, and you have new ways of decentralizing manufacturing. So if we need a change for cell therapy, that would be it. Plausible mechanism would help gene therapies immensely, as Dr. Marks was mentioning, because you can have the backbone to it and then apply it for rare diseases, and then in an appropriate and thoughtful way. So if there were regulatory changes, and that actually might require a regulatory change in Canada. So that's one where I think we should focus. And the last, and this is picking up on something Dr. Sangas is talking about, is the use of real world evidence. How to do that. And Health Canada was a leader for a period of time, and I haven't followed as closely since they had horizon scanning and work into how that might be used. But that could be a very useful framework, especially for products that have very complex mechanisms of action that might not be completely known, that might have long-term safety effects or follow-ups for 10, 15 years. Using real-world evidence to make decisions, or at least give regulators and payers confidence that you're managing it throughout the life cycle, like frameworks around those three things, super worthwhile.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And we are strongly supporting that particular point. And we are trying to find consensus driven harmonization also in the real world collection of data, because this is absolutely also promoting the equitable access across Europe. If you're really putting forward data that can generate evidence in a meaningful way, and that can really address in a coordinated manner all those different questions from the HTA, from the investors, from the payers, from the from the health systems, the different health systems. This is the coordination that I'm really screaming for, right, here in Europe, starting from the Teach to Evolve Association. But this is really a system change that needs to be applied in general. So we are using the CAR-T technology, but this is something that needs to change in general for innovation, for embracing innovation as a European community. Yeah, totally agree.
Thank you, Carmen. Any last comments, Natasha, on this?
No.
Okay, perfect. So we're at 5 minutes to the end of this webinar. We have covered an extraordinary amount of ground with all of our panelists and have very much benefited from the unique perspectives and the experience, the phenomenal experience of Dr. Marks and his many years and incredible experience at CBER of the FDA. Carmen, thank you so very much for sharing with us all of the different initiatives, that are taking place in Europe right now and what you're thinking in terms of addressing and really fast tracking the development of these really important therapies in our ecosystem. Last but definitely not least, Dr. Kekri, Patrick, for the unique perspective that you bring with respect to what is going on in Canada. And I would like to underscore the incredible opportunity that we have right now with everything happening in the world to really rethink and to be bold in how we are going to support the development of these types of therapies in Canada and really examine and take the steps necessary to make sure that we're able to capture the value of the investments that are being made in our research ecosystem and translating those into products that can benefit patients and really and support our economy as well through the support of our companies here in Canada. So we had a phenomenal discussion, and I think if we were in a very large room, there would be a standing ovation for all of the incredible input and insights that have been shared. It was really an outstanding webinar. And so I would like to thank everyone for joining us and really, again, sincerely thank all of our panelists for sharing their insights on this important topic. There is a feedback poll that should have appeared on your screen. It's appeared on mine with respect to this webinar and the CSPC in general. And there are also some additional, there is some additional information with respect to upcoming sessions with the CSPC that are posted in the chat. So I invite you to take a look at that. So we're 2 minutes to the hour. So any final comments?
I just want to say one thing, Steph, because someone did bring up, where do we go now? And I think to end on a positive note, we are very fortunate in Canada to have a loud voice with BioCannerex at the table with our funders, with our regulators, with our policymakers. And I think that is the most optimistic thing for what I do is that people who are pushing this forward, they exist in Canada, their voices are loud, and they will keep trying to disrupt the system so that we ultimately can help our Canadian patients. And so I want to thank you, Stephanie, and BioCannerex for really everything that you're doing to move this forward for our field in Canada.
Thank you very much, Natasha. I really appreciate that on behalf of BioCannerex and of course the amazing team that we have behind that are really looking to change the needle with respect to this area. So I thank you very much for that. Thanks,
and whatever
everyone.
Teach to Evolve,
Yes.
Teach to Evolve can do to support you, we are here.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Carmen. And we're proud members of the T2 Evolve Consortium.
Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks, everyone. Really appreciate
Thank
your
you.
time and your incredible insights today. It's been an honor being your moderator today, and I've learned an enormous amount.